Hello, everyone. My name is Imani Bellamy. I am an REU intern here at UT Dallas. My home institution is Coppin State University, and the title of my research is Fool Me Once, Shame on You, Understanding and Preventing Psychological Exploits in Cybercrime. So, in today's digital age, phishing is one of the most common and emotionally manipulative forms of cybercrime. Phishing attacks exploit psychological weaknesses, emotional timing, and online behavior patterns to deceive users, especially during periods of high stress. And these are one of the main reasons why I chose to focus on young adults, because they are frequently targeted due to emotional overload, academic pressure, and digital overexposure. So because of this, the study tested how different warning types like inoculation-based, generic, or none affect users' ability to detect emotionally charged phishing emails. Participants then looked at a total of 10 emails and decided if they were real or fake. And my experiment was grounded in inoculation theory, the heuristic systematic model, and the cyber routine activity theory. And I'll talk a little bit more about these theoretical frameworks a little bit later. But the findings suggest that emotionally grounded theory-based warnings improve both phishing detection accuracy and self-confidence more than generic tips or no warning at all. So here you can see the two research questions that I came up with, and these questions were developed based on gaps that I noticed in my literature review. A lot of the studies focused on demographics or general phishing trends, but only a few of them looked at emotional timing or how our digital behavior might influence scam success. And I wanted to test a more psychological real-world approach. And you might be wondering, why exactly do these questions matter? Well, it's because people often aren't targeted randomly. Scammers wait for moments when someone is stressed, emotionally reactive, or rushed, like during midterms or job searches. So, this project tests whether we can better protect people by understanding those emotional moments and behaviors rather than just giving them generic training. So, this study was built on three key psychological frameworks. We have the heuristic systematic model, the cyber routine activity theory, and inoculation theory. So the heuristic systematic model is when people use mental shortcuts when they're stressed or distracted instead of deeply analyzing. They skim and react. So in my study, this helped explain why participants clicked faster or trusted emails based on quick visual cues. Cyber routine activity theory is a theory that says that attackers exploit predictable habits, like checking emails at lunch or clicking links from familiar names. And I use this to interpret participant behavior from the pre-survey. For example, those who checked emails multiple times a day were more likely to fall for the scams. And then inoculation theory is a theory that was inspired by the medical theory that says, like a vaccine, if you prepare someone in advance for the kind of trick they might face, they're more likely to build resistance. So that's why Group C ends up receiving an inoculation style warning explaining exactly how phishing tricks people. And I chose these frameworks because they allowed me to look beyond surface behavior and gave me a chance to better understand deeper cognitive processes. Now let's go ahead and take a look at our methodology overview. So this study was conducted as a pilot study with a total of 25 participants ranging between the ages of 16 to 59, and most of those were college students. The goal here was to test the experimental design and identify early behavioral trends before scaling to a larger sample. So this study used a multi-part online experiment structured through four Google Forms. The first was a pre-survey, which was used to assess each participant's impulsivity, digital habits, and prior phishing exposure. Then participants were randomly assigned to one of three experimental groups, each with their own version of the phishing judgment task. Group A received no warning at all. Group B got a vague generic security tip similar to what you might see in everyday email systems. And Group C was shown a psychology-based warning inspired by inoculation theory. And it gave them a brief but direct message explaining that scammers often use emotional tactics like fake job offers or urgent language. So all three groups were then shown the same 10 email screenshots, which included a mix of phishing and legitimate messages. And for each email, participants would answer three questions. Would you open this email? Do you think it's legitimate? And how confident are you in your decision on a scale from 1 to 10? So this format allowed me to analyze not only accuracy and behavior, but also the role of confidence, impulsivity, and pre-warning intervention on phishing detection. So, after completing the pre-survey, participants were randomly assigned to one of three experimental groups. As I mentioned, Group A received no warning at all, Group B was shown a very generic, vague security tip, and Group C was given the inoculation-based message. Each group had its own dedicated Google form, so participants could only see their assigned condition and not be influenced by others. And this is what I mean when I say that each group had its own version. This was very key for the experimental control. So why does this setup matter? First, it prevents contamination between conditions. So if participants saw more than one warning, it would mess with the accuracy of the results. Also, it keeps the design clean and controlled, which is essential for drawing real comparisons between the groups. And it also mimics real-world variation. In real life, not everyone is going to receive the same type of cybersecurity training. Some people may get helpful prep and others won't. So this design stimulates that diversity and lets us see how each level of preparation actually affects behavior. So for the 10 emails, the topics that the emails were on were fake job offers, FAFSA or tuition deadline warnings, scholarship announcements, and I also added package delivery alerts. Well, those were just used as neutral filler content. But these emails were not random. I carefully selected them to reflect real emotional triggers that young adults commonly face, especially during school or financial stress. And then I also have a picture right there of one of the emails that they received. And this ties directly back to my research question around impulsivity, digital behavior, and emotional timing. The goal here was to stimulate realistic conditions where phishing actually works. So before we continue on, let's talk a little bit about the pre-survey. So the goal here was to understand what kind of emotional and psychological state each person was in and what their digital habits look like. So the survey had a total of 5 main sections. We had demographics, emotional state, digital behavior, and psychological traits. So the data from this survey helped explain why certain people performed the way they did later on. So it was able to give me a full picture, not just on what they did, but what may have actually influenced those decisions. Now let's take a closer look on how the pre-survey was actually designed. So for demographics, I collected things like age and gender. For current emotional state, participants rated their mood and stress levels, and this connects directly to my hypothesis that emotional vulnerability increases phishing risk. Like when someone is stressed, they might click without thinking. For online behavior patterns, I asked how often they check emails and how often they spend time online. This part ties into the cyber routine activity theory, which says that more exposure to digital spaces, especially risky ones, can raise the chances of encountering a phishing tag. And then I also did a personality snapshot. I used parts of the big 5 personality traits to measure their impulsivity. Past studies have shown that people high in these traits might take on more risk or end up acting without thinking. And then I also looked at their confidence in spotting phishing. I had participants rate how confident they were in identifying phishing emails, and this allowed me to compare how they thought they performed versus how they actually did. So overall, as I mentioned, these sections were not random. They were carefully selected to help me analyze phishing behavior from multiple angles. So just to recap here, the purpose of the pre-survey was to establish a psychological and behavioral profile of each participant and also provide a richer data set than if I was just only looking at the phishing responses alone. Now let's actually start taking a look at our results. So right now, you guys are looking at a graph that's seeing how well each group performed on average out of 10 emails, both phishing and legitimate. So Group C, which got the inoculation warning, had the highest accuracy at 6.5 out of 10. This supports the power of psychology-based theory-informed training. The inoculation approach didn't just tell them to be careful, it actually showed them what a scam looks like ahead of time, so that mental rehearsal seemed to help them recognize threats better in the real task. Surprisingly, Group A, which was the group that got no warning at all, still performed almost as well with a score of 6.22. This might mean that users rely on instinct, personal experience, or just being generally cautious, especially if they've seen phishing before. But it also raises questions like, why did a control group do better than a group that was warned? Now, when we take a look at Group B, who just got a generic caution, they actually ended up scoring the lowest out of 4.63. This points to something very important. Vague or oversimplified warnings can actually backfire. That might make users feel like they know what to look for when they really don't, which could lead to overconfidence or complacency. So these patterns show why the type of warning matters, not just that a warning is given, but how it's framed and what psychological approaches it actually uses. So just to recap, these findings challenge the assumption that any warning is better than one, and it reinforces my research question 1 and 2. Stress and habits matter, but the quality of the warning matters more than the presence of one. Now we're going to be looking at all the groups' average confidence. So this graph shows how confident participants felt about their decisions, regardless of whether they were actually right or wrong. And remember, they rated that on a scale from 1 to 10, and then I got their average. So Group C, the inoculation group, again came out on top, averaging a 7.89 in confidence. And since they also had the highest accuracy, that means that their confidence matched their ability. This alignment is important because it shows that psychology-based preparation helps participants feel and perform better. They weren't just guessing, they were sure, and they were mostly right. Group A, the norm warning group, followed with a 6.96 confidence score, which is fairly close to their accuracy. This suggests that they took a more cautious but realistic approach, likely relying on gut instincts or past experience, but they weren't blindly overestimating their abilities. Group B, however, is where things get interesting. They had the lowest accuracy but still scored fairly high with a 7.31 in confidence. This shows a potential overconfidence gap. Even though their performance didn't improve, the generic warning may have made them feel prepared, creating a false sense of security. And that can actually be really dangerous because people who think they know what to look for may end up stopping to think critically. So this chart reinforces that it's not just about warning people, it's about how we prepare them and whether that builds real awareness or if it's just an illusion of it. So these results suggest that confidence isn't always tied to ability, especially when messaging is vague. So overall, this supports my research question 2. Only theory-based interventions help users both recognize scams and feel accurate about their choices, which is a very powerful combination for real-world protection. So now we're going to start taking a look at the groups individually and looking at their average confidence versus their accuracy. So this chart shows the relationship between how accurate Group A participants were and how confident they felt. We see a R-squared value of 0.301, which signals a modest positive correlation, meaning the better someone performed, the more confident they tended to feel. So in simpler terms, it's not a strong link, but it's still noticeable. And this is important because Group A received no warning at all, so they had no external help or any type of guidance. Yet we still saw some alignment between how well they did and how confident they were. So this tells us that they weren't just guessing, they were likely using intuition, prior experience, or caution to make those decisions. However, there's also a good amount of variability in the data. Some people were very confident even when they weren't that accurate, and others were accurate but unsure. And that suggests intuition without priming isn't always reliable. So overall, Group A shows that even with no prep, people can do decently well by relying on gut instincts, but it's not consistent across everyone. That makes the case better for even more intentional training even stronger. Now let's take a look at Groups B, average confidence versus their accuracy. So this slide shows the confidence and accuracy relationship for Group B, who received the generic warning. The R-squared is 0.29, meaning that there's a modest correlation, but it's a slightly upward trend where higher accuracy loosely matches higher confidence. But overall, the confidence didn't strongly reflect actual performance. So just because they felt confident didn't mean that they were accurate. And what's more important is that several participants were clear outliers. They were very confident, but they got many answers wrong. And that's a huge red flag. One explanation is that the generic warning may have made them feel falsely secure, like I've been trained even though their detection skills weren't actually improved. This sense of security is dangerous, especially in real-world phishing situations, like emotional emails about jobs, money, or emergencies, where people assume they're safe just because they haven't heard some advice before. So Group B teaches us that surface-level warnings may do more harm than good if they don't actually change the behavior. Now let's look at Group C, average confidence versus their accuracy. So Group C was the one who received the inoculation warning. So here we see the strongest correlation of all three groups with the R-squared value of 0.521. That means confidence and accuracy move together more consistently, showing a clearer alignment between what participants thought and how they actually performed. Participants who scored high were also confident, and those who didn't do as well reported lower confidence, and that balance is very important. This supports inoculation theory. By being trained to expect manipulation, these participants weren't just better at spotting scams, they were better at judging themselves too. Not only did they perform the best, but they also had a realistic sense of their own skill level, which is crucial when you're dealing with phishing in the real world. It shows that well-crafted warnings can lead to both better performance and better self-awareness. Now let's take a look at the accuracy versus the average confidence on an individual level. So looking at the bar chart, each participant's accuracy and confidence scores are shown side by side. In Group C, we see some standout matches, like one participant who scored a 9 out of 10 and also had a 9 confidence score. This shows strong self-awareness and effective inoculation. In Group B, the story is different. Some people scored as low as a 4 or 5, but they still rated their confidence as high as a 9.4. This supports the idea of overconfidence when vague or generic warnings are used without real training. Group A showed a more cautious pattern. Confidence was generally lower even when accuracy was decent. This might reflect natural skepticism when no warning or guidance is provided. So what does this mean overall? These trends mirror the earlier group's results, but they offer deeper insight into individual behavior, showing the gap or alignment between how well people think they're doing and how well they're actually doing. Once again, Group C showed the strongest alignment, reinforcing how inoculation theory helps users not only perform better, but better judge their own performance. And it drives home this point: just feeling overconfident doesn't mean you're correct, especially if you're underinformed or misled by oversimplified advice. Now let's take a look at impulsivity and phishing accuracy. So, as I mentioned, participants completed a pre-survey that included questions about impulsive behaviors. Their answers were then averaged into a personal impulsivity score, which you can see on the table at the top. So the key patterns that I found were that higher impulsivity scores generally meant lower phishing accuracy, and this was most obvious in Group B, where people who were more impulsive still reported high confidence even though they got more wrong. Visually, graph 7 shows a clear negative correlation. As impulsivity goes up, accuracy drops. The R-squared value of 0.592 shows a strong trend, making it one of the most telling relationships in this study. The table above shows individual scores, making it easy to spot those outliers. So what does all of this mean? Impulsivity seems to reduce thoughtful decision making, especially under pressure. Even when people are warned, impulsive individuals may act too quickly or ignore the cues. This reinforces the idea that tailored interventions like inoculation are especially helpful for high impulse users who are more vulnerable to phishing. So here's just a quick recap of what I discovered across the three groups. So starting with Group C, who received the inoculation warning, they had the highest accuracy, averaging 6.5, and also the highest confidence at 7.89. This shows that psychology-based warnings grounded in inoculation theory don't just improve performance, but they also help users feel accurately confident in their decisions, especially during emotionally charged situations. Next, Group B, which got a generic warning. This group had the lowest accuracy with just 4.63, yet their confidence was still fairly high at 7.31. That mismatch is very dangerous. It shows that vague or generic warnings might give users a false sense of security. People think they've been trained, but in reality, they underperform. Lastly, Group A, who received no warning at all, their average accuracy was a 6.22 and confidence was a 6.96, surprisingly close to Group C. This suggests that without any message, people relied more on their natural caution and critical thinking, and that actually helped them. In some cases, bad training can be worse than no training at all. It really emphasizes how important it is to design warnings that are psychologically informed and are actually helpful. Looking at impulsivity, it clearly had a negative relationship with phishing accuracy. Participants who scored higher on impulsivity based on a pre-survey were less accurate in spotting phishing emails. And this reinforces the idea that emotionally decision-making and acting too quickly make people more vulnerable, and that high-impulse users need more tailored support. We also see real-world parallels. The participants who describe themselves as emotionally reactive or quick to decide were the same ones who were most likely to fall for scams. And these weren't random. Scams like fake jobs, financial aid messages, or scholarships often mimic real stress triggers, especially for college students. Lastly, even though this was just a small pilot study, the behavioral patterns were strong. With a larger sample, I likely see even clearer links between impulsivity, training style, and phishing outcomes. And all of this supports the need for cybersecurity education that's not just technical, but psychological as well. Now let's take a look at a couple limitations. So first, as I mentioned, this was a small pilot study with only 25 participants. That means that the findings are preliminary and they're not yet generalizable. They're meant to guide future research and not necessarily serve as a final conclusion. Second, there were some data quality concerns. A few participants were repeated, likely due to the open Google Form setup, and of course I cleaned those entries, but using stricter settings in the future would be helpful. Also, the testing conditions were not controlled. Since participants completed the survey remotely, there could have been a lot of things going on like distractions, multitasking, and things like that that could have affected their focus and performance. Also, there is a little bit of demographic bias. My goal was to primarily focus on college students, so this study really couldn't apply to any other groups like teens or working professionals. Lastly, there's a self-report bias that's possible. My impulsivity and behavioral scores came from pre-surveys, and those depend on how honest or self-aware participants were at that time. So in the future, I would like to conduct this experiment in a controlled environment, for example, like a lab or classroom, so I'm able to reduce distractions and ensure consistent testing conditions. I would also like to implement tools like a one response per email and login validation. And I would continue using emotionally relevant emails tailored to young adults, but I would also like to consider adapting for other populations, for example, working professionals or parents. And future studies could even test how phishing tactics change based on life stage, stress type, or seasonal timing. And also, I could investigate whether inoculation style warnings have lasting effects, for example, repeating the testing every 2 weeks or 2 months later. So overall, inoculation warnings proved effective. This shows that psychological theory can directly improve how users detect phishing and make decisions, especially when emotions are high. Second, this study reinforces that phishing is not just random. Scammers are strategic, they strike when users are stressed, impulsive, or following routine patterns, and that emotional timing is key. Thirdly, the results revealed a major gap in current digital safety education. Users may be warned generically, but they're not being trained to recognize emotional manipulation, and that's a blind spot. There's also reward value. These findings suggest that we should integrate behavioral science into cybersecurity efforts, especially for students, job seekers, or anyone under digital stress. And finally, while this was just a pilot study, the trends are clear. A larger study could confirm these insights and help shape digital safety education to be more personalized, timely, and grounded in real psychology. Thank you guys so much for listening to my presentation. I want to say thank you to Dr. Juan and Kevin as well for helping me so much in putting this together. I could not have done this without you guys.